So it is both CH and I was never sure whether one of those was silent. Was that the video? Okay, good. Thank you. I wasn't sure if that was the video. Hello, welcome everyone to the session on public policy. And I am here with two real experts on this as well as everything else. My name is Steve Waldman. I'm the co-founder of Report for America and the founder and president of a new organization called Rebuild Local News, which is a organization that advocates public policies to help strengthen community news. And I'm here with Graciela Machkovsky, the dean of the Newmark School of Journalism. And what you may not know is that she also is a real leader in one of the pioneering experiments around public policy, which we will talk to. And Bruce Putterman is the publisher of Connecticut Mirror, really one of the flagship nonprofit news organizations in the country. And what you probably didn't know is that he has also been leading a public policy effort in Connecticut. So we're going to talk about both of their experiences. But I wanted to kind of start by giving a little bit of an overview on this topic, because it is a little bit unusual and not something we talk about a lot. And of course, usually when the first reaction people have when you say, what about government support for the news media, is, are you crazy? That's the worst idea I've ever heard, to have government support for local news. So a few things about that. First of all, as a country and a community, we have had government support for news all the time. We just mostly didn't know about it. I mean, the founding fathers, one of the first things that they did as a new Congress was to approve a massive subsidy for the newspaper industry in the form of a postal subsidy. In modern dollars, it would be equal to about $40 or $50 billion, so about the size of NASA is what they decided they would put government funds in. And it's reassuring, because these are literally the people who wrote the First Amendment. James Madison, who had something to do with that, thought that newspapers shouldn't pay any postage at all. He thought having even a subsidized version was a tax that was insidious. So, and then there's other things throughout American history. The FCC's decision to grant TV licenses to local stations instead of national, as it's done in many other countries, was hugely significant. Their decision to have a quarter of the airwaves be for public broadcasting was significant. There's all sorts of things like that that have had a big impact on the development of the news media, and also some things that didn't happen that had a big impact. For instance, the fact that none of the antitrust regulators for the last 20 years batted an eyelash as hedge funds and private equity firms were buying up 50% of the daily newspaper circulation in America. That was a significant lack of public policy awareness and action as well. So one of the things that you probably are not aware of is that there's actually been, in the last, really almost just the last year or two, a flowering of new activity and new ideas about public policy. And what you see from these, and I'm going to just tick through them real quickly before, and then dive into a couple in particular, is that they all start with a real consciousness of the risks, that it is true that there are ways in which government support could really go badly and do more harm than good, but that it's possible, that you shouldn't be paralyzed. And I think that's our general approach is when you've had an 82% drop in the size of newspaper advertising revenue in less than 2 decades. So that's the size, bigger than the collapse of the coal industry or the steel industry, things like that, and undermining the core functions of democracy. We have to look at this. We're not going to get there just with philanthropy and improved business models. This has to be the third leg. But we have to do it really intelligently and learn from other countries and learn from local experiments. Now, we tend to think of, when we think of it to the extent it happens at all, we think of public broadcasting as sort of the taxpayer model, and that is still really important. But there's some other ideas as well that are kind of kicking around out there, and I'll just mention a few. And by the way, the organization that I run now, Rebuild Local News, it started a few years ago as an informal coalition of about, well, it's now 30 or 35 different national and state organizations that are all interested in public policy to help local news. And everyone was kind of running in different directions, and we just got everyone together in the same room, or almost everyone, to figure out, well, are there things we agree on, and is there a common agenda? And it was interesting because we got publishers and the labor unions, and we had Black and Hispanic publishers and rural and nonprofit and for-profit, and a lot of people, especially the publishers and the unions, so they would, be attacking each other by day and then come to our meetings and try to figure out a way of working together on public policy. So there's a few interesting ideas out there. There was just a federal bill that was proposed a couple weeks ago that's really interesting, both in its substance and its kind of political origins. It has two components. One is a tax credit for small businesses that advertise or sponsor in local news. So the tax credit actually goes to restaurants and dry cleaners, but only if they advertise in local news. It's really, and this is the one idea I would say that has the most traction in Republican states, because it's quite literally a small business tax credit, but one that really helps local news. And it's also, it has the advantage of it's not someone in the government deciding who gets what. It's like the restaurant is deciding who gets what. And there's a market element, like you still have to prove that you're worthy of getting advertising. So, and then the second piece of the bill was a payroll tax credit for hiring and retaining local reporters. So it's a little similar to some of the PPP that happened during COVID, but targeted toward the hiring of local reporters. I really like that too, because the incentives are on target. It's where the need is. So what's interesting about this is that this was introduced by a woman named Claudia Tenney, who's a very conservative Republican from upstate New York, a Trump Republican, and as well as a Democrat, Suzanne DelBene. And that's pretty interesting because it means there's like a Republican-friendly route. And so we're starting to see that first idea get taken off and submitted as bills in state legislatures. So one is the tax credit for small businesses that advertise. Two is the payroll tax credit. Three is an idea we're going to talk about quite a bit more in a sec, the idea of governments are advertisers themselves. And they spend, in some cases, a lot of money on advertising. And a lot of it doesn't go to local news. It goes to national and billboards and Google and Facebook. And so there's this movement that this woman created, but has now spread across the land, which is to say, how about you're spending this money anyway, wouldn't it be great both for communities and the effectiveness of your ads to actually push that toward community news? So we're getting a lot of interest. There's other states, California, and other states and cities that are looking at that. There's a kind of burgeoning idea around, well, maybe there's some way through tax credits or vouchers or something else of subsidizing the consumer that subscribes to a local news organization. I would say that idea is like conceptually brilliant and wonderful. There's still like mechanics that honestly I don't think are fully baked yet, but it's sort of an exciting idea in theory. There's New Jersey is doing a direct grant approach. They have the New Jersey Information Consortium took money that was from the FCC Spectrum auction when they were auctioning off airwaves, and they put some of that into local news. It's a very creative idea. I get really nervous about grant programs to journalism, honestly, but they've done it in a really thoughtful way. Like they really have looked at the firewalls and how to do it in a way that doesn't lead to problems. So that's a model. Fellowships, sort of Report for America style fellowships. So these are not just for a month or two, but the big example is California. The California State Legislature gave $25 million for a program administered by the Berkeley School of Journalism, $25 million for reporters to go out in local newsrooms for a year or two. So it's a really meaningful help of reporting help. And there's a smaller version of that in New Mexico and Washington State. So that's starting to catch on. There's a sort of, I think on a legislative level, there's sort of an appeal because they're used to dealing with universities. There's already a line item. They know what that means, kind of. They know what a fellowship is, so it doesn't seem quite as alien. And then the last idea, well, two ideas more, but the last of the less controversial ones, I'll say, is something that we call replanting. And basically, that's the idea that we have this, in addition to needing to seed startups and great new models, we have this other issue, which is there are 6,000 existing newspapers. And some of them, our theory is, could actually be serving their communities if they had different owners. That some of the problem is the ownership structure. And so replanting refers to a series of different philanthropic and policy ideas to help local communities, nonprofits usually, but could be other things, buy newspapers or help convert existing for-profits into nonprofits. So that idea is like, it's sort of, again, it's sort of, there's no state that's doing it in a concrete way, but there's a lot of discussion. The last one I'll mention, which has not been on our agenda of Rebuild Local News, but I want to mention it because it is on other people's agendas, is something called the Journalism Competition and Preservation Act. And that is, if you've read about the Australia model, so this is the idea of the government setting up a mechanism that forces Google and Facebook to pay media companies. It's a bit of a controversy. Our particular coalition kind of divided down the middle, so we stayed neutral. But there's a lot of people who think that really should be, you know, a key approach. Others who think it's not such a good idea. So I tend to talk about it a little bit less, but just in full disclosure, I wanted to put that out there because that is one of the big ideas out there. So let me stop talking and start getting a little more into the meat of this. Oh, before I do that, thank you to Microsoft for sponsoring this session. Microsoft's actually been a kind of, so they're a supporter of Rebuild Local. They've been a supporter of kind of, I would say, creative policymaking on this. So let's start with you, Bruce, about just tell us your journey. You probably didn't think when you started Connecticut Mirror that part of your job was going to be walking the halls of the Connecticut legislature. But tell us the whole story.
Okay, so just one quick clarification. I was not at the Mirror at the founding, so don't want just a quick fact check on that. The Connecticut Mirror is a nonprofit. We were founded. We cover public policy in Connecticut. So when I took this job in 2017, we were founded in 2010. I didn't envision myself walking the halls, even though all of our reporters, in fact, do walk the halls of the legislature yes, on a regular basis. But I'm on the other side of that wall and don't typically walk the halls. But in this past January at the governor's inaugural ball, a state rep from my town, who I know well, said, Bruce, you guys are doing such great work. What can we in the legislature do to support local journalism? And she asked that question because Connecticut, while not a news desert, there are still 17 daily newspapers, daily print newspapers in a tiny little state. Connecticut is what Penny Abernathy, academic, refers to as news poverty. All of the newspapers in our state, including perennial powerhouses like the Hartford Courant, have shrunk to become, you know, shells of themselves, like has happened in so many other parts of the country. So I recited for this state representative essentially the list that Steve just recited for you of all of the ways that all of the ideas for public support for journalism. And she said to me, what about that thing they're doing in New York? That sounds particularly interesting. It sounds easy. And I said, well, I'll get you some information about that. And a week later, she had submitted a bill into the House. It wasn't a perfect bill, in fact, far from it. But because the Mirror, so all of the for-profit newspapers in Connecticut use our content, so we already have kind of a relationship with them. Most of the nonprofit news organizations in the state also use our content, and vice versa with the nonprofits. And so we were in kind of a unique position to convene everybody and mobilize all of these different news organizations around trying to advance this bill or some version of this bill that this particular state rep had filed. I testified, I provided the lead testimony for the bill. The bill came out of committee, the bill was adopted in the House. It did not get called in the Senate by the end of the session. So the Senate adjourned, and that was a good news, bad news scenario in the sense that it does give us 8 months to kind of figure out how to make this not perfect bill better, to figure out some of the nuts and bolts and administrative and logistical aspects of how this might work. So that's what we're in the process of doing now, and we're gearing up to hopefully have the bill reintroduced in 2024. Now, the bill itself basically mandates, if you will, that all state advertising, and so Steve referenced this, but the state spends money on economic development advertising, tourism advertising, some of it in-state, so there's out-of-state tourism advertising, there's in-state tourism advertising. There's public awareness health campaigns, smoking cessation, there's opioid money coming to all of the states, and the state's going to invest money in opioid treatment awareness sorts of initiatives, and on and on. There's lots of public service advertising that our state and all states engage in to some degree. In Connecticut, most of that advertising is spent on television. All 4 TV stations are owned by out-of-state companies. Or in the Hartford Courant, still the largest newspaper in the state, even though it's 15% the size it was 15 years ago. And the Hearst papers. Hearst owns 7 daily newspapers in Connecticut. So both the Courant, an Alden/Tribune paper, and Hearst, also out-of-state news organizations. So the state's marketing dollars, these companies are all making profit margin on those marketing dollars, and that margin is going to out-of-state stockholders and not necessarily being reinvested in the state. And in the meantime, there are still a handful of locally owned newspapers. There's several nonprofits. There's 2 large public radio networks in Connecticut. And we are not benefiting really from that state spending at all. Which, by the way, is an equity issue in the sense that if the state is trying to reach people, everybody, with public awareness advertising, it's kind of bizarrely ironic that they're spending their money with commercial news organizations that have a paywall in order for you to see their content, whereas we and the other nonprofits and the for-profit hyperlocals don't have paywalls. We're all free to consume. So that's kind of a key part of our argument in our testimony before the legislature, that this is, if nothing else, an equity issue. So what the bill mandates then is that 50% of all state advertising dollars would be spent with locally owned for-profit companies, locally based nonprofits, and locally based ethnic media. And those are the broad parameters. There's lots of other details to work out, like how do you define locally owned? Like Hearst, Connecticut is technically Connecticut-based, but the parent company is in New York, and we all know that the surplus, and they do make money in Hearst, Connecticut, is getting sucked back into the Hearst Tower in New York, and is not staying in Connecticut necessarily. So the details, we're kind of working through that, and Graziella and her folks have much more experience in terms of how to manage that process. And maybe this is a good time to pivot over to you.
Well, let me just ask one quick question, and then we'll go over. So part of what's unique about the Connecticut bill, most of these have some language about it needs to go to local news. Connecticut's the only state that I know of that has locally owned. And it's just a very interesting approach, and it's going to be fascinating to see how the politics work of it, of like, are they going to object, and will they push back? It hasn't really happened yet.
No, I mean Connecticut is a very politically is a very democratic state at the legislative level and in the state house. So it passed the House overwhelmingly on a partisan basis, or well, I know you guys define it. You guys said it was bipartisan because 4 Republicans did vote
Absolutely.
for the bill. So fine, we'll take it. The Senate is even more tilted toward Democrats. So if we can the victory here is going to be getting it called in the state Senate in the next session. I don't think that that distinction is going to matter.
One area that you sometimes get resistance on these things is actually from the executive branch itself, not necessarily on ideological grounds, but on hassle grounds. And did they push back at all, saying like, well, if you're excluding all the out-of-state folks, there's not enough volume, there's not enough inventory for us to put our money into?
So they haven't pushed back. I think that was also because they were responding. The only formal response to them has been during the chaos of the legislative session. We will find out, I think, this fall as we begin to engage more deeply in conversations with the Department of Administrative Services, which does what the name suggests. And so we'll figure that out. I will say, I think there's a hassle factor both from the administration, but the bigger hassle factor potentially is from the advertising agencies that the state handles to place the advertising. And having spent the first 12 years of my career working for an advertising agency, I understand the desire to minimize hassle and minimize activity related to placing media buys. They don't want to spend, $5,000 here and $7,000 here. They'd much rather just spend $25,000 here and $25,000 here and be done with it.
That's a big
barrier.
issue. So, and by the way, I think you went past it quickly, but the fact that this was passed by the Connecticut Assembly is a big deal. Like that's
first in the country, I believe, of this kind of a bill.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, on the state level. Yeah,
state level. Yeah.
Okay, so let's now talk about New York City. As we said, this idea was really pioneered in New York at CUNY, and walk us through both before, during, and after.
Yes, so thank you, and thank you for having me here. So the idea actually started with 2 other women, Sarah Bartlett, who was my predecessor as the dean of what was then called the CUNY Newmark, the CUNY Graduate School of Journalism, and is now the Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism at CUNY. And so she was my predecessor, and in 2011, she had just started. And she wanted to know where was the city of New York spending their advertising money, and where was the money going. The school had started at the Center for Community Media, which I then ran before becoming the dean. The Center of Community Media is this amazing institution within the school that serves community media, originally in New York and then now nationally. And with community media, we mean media serving immigrant communities, communities of color, linguistic communities. New York City has a very vibrant community media sector. It's more than 300 media outlets that serve New Yorkers in 37 languages, including English. And those are the papers and digital outlets and radio stations and TV channels that serve immigrants and people of color. So it includes Black media and Latino media and Asian media and what's called ethnic media and immigrant media. And so Sarah, my predecessor, knew that there was this vibrant industry or sector there, and they were rarely receiving any advertising funding from the city of New York. So she thought, where is this money going? So she foiled the city. So she basically did a reporter's work and did an investigation and found out that only 18%, 1/8, of the advertising funding from the entire city of New York went to community media, to these 300 and plus outlets, and that 82% went to a handful, about 6, I think it was, mainstream media outlets, so the New York Post, the Daily Post, the New York Times, etc. And she saw an equity, as you were saying, she saw an equity issue there. She didn't think, though, that the city of that would resonate politically, because she thought that it was not the purpose of the city of New York's advertising strategy to find equity in distribution. That is not our goal for the city. But the goal for the cities have to advertise, they're mandated to advertise to keep citizens informed. And so the argument, so what Sarah did, she went to Julie Sandorf, who's another amazing woman who runs the Ripson Foundation, and funded this project. And they went to another amazing woman, it's always women, I'm sorry, who was the commissioner for immigrant affairs at the city of New York. And she brought it to, this is at the beginning of de Blasio administration. So when de Blasio starts his mayoral he received this report, and he went to his people and said, let's do something about it. And what that led to was an executive order by the de Blasio administration in which the mayor decided that all of the 50 city agencies in New York that placed advertising in the city, and this includes all advertising, had to spend 15% of their budget for print and digital media in community media. That was signed in June 2019. And then what we decided at the Center for Community Media, I had just started as the executive director at the Center for Community Media, and we thought that unless there was, we saw that that was an executive order, it was not legislation, but we thought that it was very easy for the agencies to just disregard or ignore this. We thought, where is the accountability piece? Who's gonna force all of the marketing directors in the agencies, and then another intermediary organization, which are the media agencies, the agencies that place the ads in media. There was no motivation, there was no punishment if they didn't do it. It was an executive order that said 50% should go there, and at the end of the year, the city will publish a report saying whether this was accomplished or not. And, but there was no penalty, so we looked at it as journalists, and we thought, okay, what does it take to get this to succeed? And we created a unit. A unit means one person, another woman, Darlie Gervais, who's amazing. And she was hired, and her entire job her full-time job was to reach out to all of these, every stakeholder, so the marketing directors, the media agencies, the ad agencies, and the publishers, and the people close to de Blasio then, who were monitoring compliance, and create an infrastructure for this to succeed. So we created a list of marketing directors and their contact information so that every publisher knew who they were and they could reach out to them. We let the publishers know what campaigns were coming, and we created a whole information structure for this to succeed. At the end of the first year, and then we created a lot of goodwill and relationship building, so we would have a direct relationship with the marketing directors to make sure that they understood what was the value of community media and why it was really important for the city of New York that this was successful, and that they would send these ads because that would in place create this, would make this city, would keep this communities vibrant and informed, and that was good for everything else the city was trying to do. So that was very successful, and then we also added the accountability piece. So we still do a report, as a journalist report at the end of the year. We just report on where the money went. So we also signed an MOU with the city of New York at the time to make sure that they would share with us the raw data about ad placement. So we wanted to know, because they were going to say at the end of the year, okay, we complied, 50% went to community media outlets, but they were under no obligation to say where and how much money. So we did that. We filled that void, and we created annual reports where we basically showed New Yorkers, it's a public report, you can find it in our website, how much money went to each outlet and how and what were those campaigns and what were the ads, and they can go to the outlets and see them. We also had created a directory. This is a key. We've been talking about this with Steve for a long time. You know, who gets, when this legislation passes, who qualifies as a media outlet that should receive advertising. And that has become more complicated than in the past because it's now such a fractured and uneven ecosystem, and also because there are outlets that are not necessarily legitimate, you know, news outlets, but that might apply for this, etc. And in New York, there was also the complication of language. You know, it was hard to maybe for the ad placer they didn't have Chinese language, you know, expertise or fluency. So how did they know this was a legitimate outlet to get the ads? So we did that for them, and we created a directory. We did a full, you know, we did a map of New York, so because we learned that a lot of the city agencies needed to place geographically, so they need to reach out. They knew, for example, this was launched a year before COVID, so when COVID hit, this was in full speed. And one of the city's, you know, goals was during COVID was to make sure that the people who were not getting vaccinated had access to the information about vaccines. And so that was, for example, they knew that, for example, Black communities and Black Caribbean communities in uptown Manhattan, that was an area where vaccines were not being taken by people. And so they needed to see in the map which outlets, which community media outlets serve those communities. So they could go to Harlem and find all of the community media outlets and local outlets in Harlem, click on the map, and they would have a pop-up with all the information about the outlet and the contact information to place the ad. So it took it was a big infrastructure that we built around that. Then after that, so it was very successful the first year. $10 million went to community media in New York City, practically, I mean, in practice, saving them from a really bad year. This was 2020, so these outlets had lost almost all of between 75% and 100% of their revenue, which came mostly from local businesses and members of the community. So this replaced that funding, and we did a report, and we also reported on how the publishers and the outlets used the funding that they got from the city and what was that used for. And that piece of accountability also served to, you know, facilitated a very important part of this, which was that we wanted to make sure that there were no strings attached, so that there were no, you know, media, you know, ad placers saying, you know, you need to endorse, you know, the mayor if he runs for re-election, whatever it was. So, so we kept an eye on that, and we kept the publishers very close. We have a person serving them. They can call us when they don't have, when they need more information about how things are going. So in when de Blasio ended his term and Eric Adams became the mayor, before becoming the mayor, he was part of a group of city council members who introduced legislation to make this into a law, and that was the legislation was passed in the summer of 2021, 2022, I don't know, when was, I don't know, what year is this, 2023? I think it was 2021, because we did the first year report a few months ago. So, and then the legislation, there was a bit, this is maybe too granular, but the change with the legislation was that it broadening up to all advertising, and so originally it was just digital and print, because most of community media are digital and print outlets. And then the legislation broadened it up to also TV and radio, and changed the mandate of the 50% to a goal of a 50%, because the budget change went from, you know, just the budget for print and digital was very small, and the full budget is much bigger. So we went from 18 million to 260 million, so that's the difference. And so now the idea is that the legislation says that there's a goal of the City of New York to fund community and ethnic media. 50% of the ads should go to them, but for that, the industry needs to grow to be able to absorb such a huge amount of money. But community media has, this has been 3 years, going to be the 4th year, and every year there's been more money going there. So it was 10 years the first year, 10 million the first year, 15 million the second year, 26 million the third year.
What was the typical amount that a single newspaper might have gotten?
It's very, because it's such an uneven landscape, you have outlets that have 35 staffers, and they're big outlets that are part of national networks, like the Chinese papers, for example. And then you have very small, hyper-local outlets that are just one person. The average size is 5 people in every newsroom, but it's very uneven. So, and some outlets reach a very small group of people, a few thousand, and some others reach a lot of people. So it's really the outlets, and I think this is a good idea, actually. The outlets need to, and this is something we did. We have a full program to help the outlets create professional media kits so they can actually show their impact and the size of their audience, because a lot of them were not able to do that before. And the amount you receive is directly proportional to your audience and to your reach and to your value. For example, there's 3 outlets serving communities in Urdu in your city, and so they're the only outlets that serve communities in Urdu. So the city knows that the publishers of these outlets are actually leaders in those communities, and it's important for them, if they want to reach those communities, to go to those outlets. But there was some of them get 200,000, some of them get 2,000. So it's very.
I saw a really cool example of this, which is the Haitian Times used, I think they got like 85,000 or something.
70,000.
And they used that to get 2 Report for America reporters. So they were able to, add 2 reporters as a result of the money from Ad Boost. The name of this initiative has been Ad Boost. And by the way, Rebuild Local and CUNY have teamed up to create a kit that will be going live basically in the next 2 weeks or so, that will go soup to nuts of like, how do you start one of these? What are the things you need to do along the way? It will have a model bill, actual legislative language, a model executive order language, examples, pretty much everything we could think of that would, because the goal is to really try to replicate this and refine it too. Like, this is kind of a new thing, and we all know that this could go badly in some ways, so we're all very attentive to learning. And that was actually one of the things I wanted to ask, was that, like, we know, especially in other countries, that sometimes advertising is used by bad actors as the club. Has that happened at all?
We didn't see that in New York. And when you mean bad actors, you mean governments?
Yeah.
I mean, I come from Argentina, and so this is a very bad idea in Argentina, and I've seen that used always, all my career there, like in bad ways. So if you're not, everybody's supposed to get government advertising, a lot of money goes into that, but basically the outlets who are less critical to the governments are the ones who get more money, and if you are critical, then it gets pulled. So, so it's a horrible idea.
So how do you avoid that problem?
So, well, here, because there's legislation, there's accountability. I think the fact that there was a third party watching was really, really important. The fact that there's a report at the end of the year, the city has by law now has to report where the money goes, so this is public information now, which it was not the case before. So just creating that, and I think another thing that is to me is very important, I used to, for a brief period of my life, I was a publisher of a digital outlet, and it's very important that this is not just your only source of revenue, because then that also creates a dependency from government funding. So I think this is a really great idea if it is part of a multi source funding program and model.
So just one thing to add to that is that, to me, this all works best when we as publishers maintain all of our autonomy. So if there are bad actors, if the governor of Connecticut, 3 months before an election, puts out a bunch of state-funded in-state tourism ads to kind of tout his economic development prowess or whatever, we still have the ability to say, no, we're not going to run that advertising, just like we do with any advertising right now. And that's especially important for nonprofits who can't be partisan at election time, well, ever. And we don't, just as a matter of being overly conservative, I guess, relative to our 501c3 status, don't endorse candidates. We don't run political advertising. We don't get near elections in that regard.
On the political stuff, there's the art of making the policy have firewalls and have third-party independent, but there's also, before you get that, there's the awkward moment where you're lobbying, where you're advocating for a policy before politicians. What was that like? And do you have any tips on how to do that in a way that feels comfortable and ethical?
The day I testified, the morning of the testimony, one of our reporters said, "Something tells me you would be involved in something like this. Are you?" I said, "Well, yes, I am." So we didn't really talk about it.
But they didn't know beforehand. That's good.
They didn't know. I didn't really want them to know. I didn't want the newsroom to necessarily have to be caught up in that. But then that afternoon, of course, we did have the first of several conversations related to, well, how are we going to cover this if it actually advances out of committee? We can't ignore it because, first of all, it's a first in the nation state initiative. It would be kind of innovative. And let's face it, we are, as a news organization, particularly interested in those first in the country kinds of stories. So we decided that we didn't really decide anything. We kind of thought, okay, maybe we'll have some other news organization, a sister organization of ours in another state, cover the story if it was worth covering, instead of us trying to cover it.
Well, and I think that transparency is the key. This comes up a lot. Like we get this question a lot in Rebuild Local on various things. So what's the right way to do it? And frankly, on the newspaper side, on the traditional newspaper side, they do this all the time. The publishers are constantly lobbying for this and that.
Right.
So and to some degree, it's sort of, it's the same kind of ethical standards that you need to do when you're dealing with an advertiser. Don't let you have to decide not to let it affect your coverage. And stick to it. But we've had some instances of people who said, we actually don't feel comfortable lobbying, but we'll write an editorial because that's above board and we're just, we're just saying what we think and everyone will know there's nothing hidden about it. So that's another way. How about for you? Was there any awkward moments in the advocacy side?
We don't lobby. We don't do that piece.
So how did it just immaculate?
So what we did is it was at all. But there were other people who were, with the executive order, there was this, commissioner within the de Blasio administration who got the report, and she went to de Blasio,
okay.
and we were not part of that conversation, but we provided the report and the information, and we had conversations with her, and she was a member of the circle of the Center for Community Media because she was serving immigrants in New York City. And then for the legislation, we just saw it happen. I mean, we didn't participate in that. We did, before that legislation passed, we did offer a platform for all of the publishers to sign an open letter, and we published the open letter, advocating for that and asking, and we held many town halls and conversations, and we invited during the electoral campaign when Eric Adams was running for mayor, we usually do, traditionally we host debates with community media and the candidates for mayor, and so we hosted, and we made sure that in every one of these debates there was a question asked about this initiative.
What a coincidence.
So they would know about it and how good it was. But we're not allowed to do lobbying, so that part we don't do.
I want to open up for questions. Yeah.
I think they want you to go to the microphone.
Oh, sorry.
Hi, I was hoping you could kind of talk about the impact in terms of, is there enough money from just requiring state government to spend their ads this way, to save local news, or, or is the next step of this also trying to require businesses to spend money in this way?
Well, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, we actually don't exactly, we've got the FOI request going in to understand, well, how much state advertising money are we actually talking about? And then divide it in half because the bill only requires 50% of that money to be spent with local and nonprofit news organizations. So none of us are under any illusions that this is going to have a significant impact on our newsrooms. And from my perspective, I'm not even going to, if we get $25,000, $50,000 out of this, that would be great. I'm not sure it would be even that much. That will not go into operating costs because it's not going to be money we can necessarily count on. I see that as kind of for investment or one-time sorts of costs. I guess the broader hope is that it kind of is a first step. It's a beachhead in modeling for other advertisers who also are largely ignoring us from an advertising perspective. They consume us, voraciously, and they always tell us, you guys are doing great work, but they don't actually pony up the advertising dollars, which is a separate problem that we have to manage and have to deal with. But the hope is that this becomes a little bit of a model for others to emulate as we go forward, including in state government, municipal government, and we haven't even talked about public notices, which are a huge expenditure still in our state, at the state level and the municipal level. And we shied away from it a little bit because our coalition is comprised of for-profit local news organizations and nonprofits. The for-profit, family-owned, Connecticut-based news organizations still do generate a fair amount of money from public notices. And so one of the questions is, do we kind of try to go for some of the public notice money as well, or do that separately? But in any event.
I think, I don't know if you can talk about New York State, but I mean, at least on the federal level, at least $1 billion, they spend at least $1 billion a year on advertising. We have heard, it's not confirmed yet, but the California government by itself is in the hundreds of millions of dollars. I don't know if you have a sense of
I think thank you for that question. I think there's two things about that. One, this should be information that is public, because this is taxpayers' information, and every city and every state should actually, in my opinion, as a journalist, just be more transparent about how they
spend. And in our kit, we sort of say, first step, find out how much
it is. So we're about to release now. We foiled the city of New York first, and now we're doing it with the state. So we're going to have, for the first time, if anyone is from the state of New York here, we're going to release within a month, now in September, the numbers for New York State. And we had to foil because the information, it's public, but it's not publicly available. Another important thing to say is that, and it's a lot of money, so in New York City, we know it's 260 million. It depends, every year changes, because it depends on how much it's allocated during the budget, season to the city, but it was 260 the year before, and we'll see how much it's this year. And I think an important point is, and we've discussed this many times too, that no one's advocating, that I know, for new kind of funding to be created, like pots of money created to go into local media, but these are big budgets that are spent every year and that have been, part of the city budgets and the state budgets and the federal budget forever. And so that money is spent, it goes somewhere. A lot of that money goes to, billboards and street kind of advertisement and the MTA and, in the case of New York, the subways, et cetera. A chunk goes into TV stations, but there's never been policy that connects that spending with the value of local media and news media as an instrument to keep people informed, which is the goal of these advertising efforts.
As another point of reference, if the federal government has $1 billion or so, if we were able to get a 50% set aside, that would mean, $500 million, which is bigger than the entire budget of the corporation for public broadcasting. So it's a decent size.
Can folks just line up at the mics?
Yes, yeah, please, everyone that has a question.
So a lot of the conversation today has been about local media and local news and saving local news. I run the Community Info Co-op. Part of that is a local news program we run in New Jersey called the Jersey Bee. We're dedicated to serving people's news and information needs. And a lot of the conversation today has not been about meeting community information needs, but has instead have been about like meeting the bottom line of local news publishers. Though there is a variety and there is equity in that industry, we haven't actually discussed the efficacy of the policy as it relates to like actually serving people's needs. So could you address how it does that, and if it doesn't, why is that not a priority?
I'm not sure how we have not addressed that. I think, I mean, one of the points I think we made is that in New York, for example, what we did is to make the case that this was important because communities needed to be served in terms of their information needs, that this was not, for the city, it was not a question of equity. I mean, though equity is very important and critical, but it was a question of getting the information to the outlets that could serve those communities who are served by those outlets. And if they were not going to those outlets, so they were not serving the information needs of those communities. So I don't know, to me the line is very clear and it's very...
I don't think there's a difference between helping the bottom line of community journalism and helping equity. Like that the way that community organizations can serve their communities better is to have viable business models, whether they're nonprofits or for-profits. But there is a real issue with public policy, which is that one of the hard things about public policy is very often, probably the norm, is that public policies tend to get written by the legacy players, and usually the bigger players, and policy tends to favor those people. And sometimes it's intentional and blatant and power grab to keep other innovators and startups behind. Sometimes it's just that's who's at the table and that's what they think of. So it's quite challenging to come up with policies that are sort of future friendly, that are open to, especially will help smaller players, which I think is part of what you're getting at.
My question specifically is about people have information needs, and there's plenty of research and documentation that shows that existing media companies and news media don't do a good job of understanding people's information needs and meeting those needs. So what we're talking, like this just sounds like giving money to like we need to support healthcare, so let's give money to the health insurance companies because they facilitate these transactions for us with community members, but they don't necessarily serve their needs. So my question is not, in general, news organization exists so people have access to something, but how does this policy ensure that that something is actually good quality news and information?
It doesn't.
Right.
That is not the role of government, I don't think. I think it would be very dangerous for the government to have a plan where the government is requiring quality in news organizations.
In New Jersey, I'm going to sit down, but in New Jersey, the New Jersey Civic Information Consortium, all it says is must meet people's news and information needs. It's a very basic requirement that is generally applicable. So I think yes, this policy doesn't meet that, but to say it's dangerous and it won't work, there's a multi-million-dollar fund. It's the biggest media funder in New Jersey now. Millions of dollars have gone to meeting people's news and information needs. So I just want to make sure that.
And how do you prove? Who measures that is effective?
It's a nonprofit. It's a public charity created and funded by the state. There's a board of representative stakeholders. There's a program officer. It's the direct grant model, and it's serving the needs of people in a lot of different. They're working with libraries and high schools, and really working to meet people's info needs, not just subsidize the news media.
But I think the key thing is it's not a government agency. It's government funded, or from the Spectrum auction. But the smart thing that they did in setting that up was setting it up as an independent nonprofit with a board of folks from all over the state and universities and stuff like that. And I think that's the right way to do it. And I did mention that as one of the examples.
I just want to make sure that it doesn't get overlooked in the conversation of like, it's not possible. Thank you.
Hi. Arturo Carmona with the Latino Media Collaborative. How you doing, Graciela? Big fan of the work and that's happened in New York. We've been leading a lot of work in California over the last 3 years in establish a $25 million fellowship program. We also passed legislation that sought to create a report to understand how the state's spending its dollars. Unfortunately, it didn't have the teeth that you're talking about. So we're now doing a second version to figure out what the agencies are spending, because they're actually doing the spending. So it's been a big learned experience. We also have a piece of legislation now that seeks to do a set-aside of 50% of state advertising money, which is in the hundreds of millions of dollars. It fluctuates depending on the budget year. And one of the things that we're starting to see is that you have an ethnic media community and a super majority people of color state, where ethnic media is not well organized, doesn't have infrastructure, doesn't have that lobbying advocacy capacity, but yet has the biggest news deserts, the largest needs, and you have a community media sector that's more active, more vibrant. How do you deal with those dynamics when real competition for resources are emerging? And how do you prioritize those communities with the greatest need? How are you guys managing? As we look up to the model of New York, it most closely mimics, from a population demographic perspective, the work that we're doing in New York.
Well, we didn't make those decisions, and we worked together.
Just from an analysis perspective, yeah.
So we worked with groups, with outlets in California to see if the New York model could be replicated. We worked with a group of independent media in Chicago, CIMA also, and they did get an executive order passed there. One thing we discovered, and I think it goes to what you were saying at the beginning, is that the structure of, every city and state, they allocate advertising budgets, and they work differently. The way the ad, placement happens is very different, and the budgets sometimes are completely scattered in different pockets of, the government. So I remember when we worked with CIMA in Chicago just to do the FOIA, it took like 2 years or something, because it was just so hard to understand where those budgets were, because they were just all over. It was not more kind of consolidated as it was in New York City. And I know California was very hard to get the information because of that, because all of the counties, and it was just very, very difficult. We didn't do really any, I don't know, maybe you have an answer for that, but we didn't do any decision in terms of, we made sure that we were not going to be the arbiters or how the money was allocated. We would not. Sometimes the marketing director would call and say, I have this budget, who should I give it to at the beginning? And we were like, we're not going to be making that decision. It should be based on the needs of, the purpose of the city.
I think this is one of the real riddles of this whole thing, is like, if you get very, I always say, like, you have to design any public policy on the assumption that someone you really don't like is going to run it. And you can't just imagine what would it be like if we were, giving out the money. You have to imagine what would it be like if people you don't like are giving out the money. And that makes it different from foundations. Like if we were running a foundation, we'd have a completely different approach, and we would actually be way more focused on quality and factors like that. So that pushes public policy a little more in the blunt instrument direction, but you don't want it to go too far in that direction, because then you just end up like slathering money on people companies that don't need it, or companies that have ignored communities, and it doesn't get to the communities that you're talking about. So it's finding, the sort of neutral types of rules that are relatively objective, but point the resources in the direction where the need is. That is kind of the riddle. So as an example, in California, as you know, there's another bill also, which is a kind of California version of the JCPA, the Make Google and Facebook Pay for Content. And our approach, meaning Rebuild Local News's approach, is to say, putting aside the merits of that particular approach, it doesn't do enough to help community news. Maybe it has merits to it, it has arguments to it, but it could be better. It could be altered to make it more likely to help, ethnic media and also smaller media in general, rural media. So we proposed that, hey, why don't you pair that with the 50% set aside that you talked about, and have some chunk of that really be earmarked or kind of targeted toward community media. Or we had another idea we floated is that if you're going to have a pool like this, have a guaranteed minimum that would be targeted towards smaller players. So it's hard to figure out how to get at those goals, but in a way that meets that first test of like, will this still work when it's being run by someone you don't like?
I would just
think we
add,
might
add real quickly that, I mean, we're thinking about this, at least in Connecticut, in terms of the way you think about any kind of a movement, which is, let's get something passed, and to get something passed right now, it can't, to me, interfere with the mechanisms of the market all that much, or else we're not going to get the support. I mean, part of the big benefit of the advertising bills is they're revenue neutral, as Graziano said. And so to the degree that we start adding on other elements, that minimizes the chance of passage. So it's kind of what I said. It's almost, you know, it's the camel's nose in the tent, and then we burrow in deeper and deeper.
Yeah, and some places are going to be able to do things that other places aren't. Seattle is looking at a really interesting experiment around a voucher system that would be like a credit to subscribers. And I think I'm really excited that they're doing that, but I don't think it would pass anywhere else. But I think it's great to try. You know?
Hey.
And then I think actually
Oh, sorry.
are we out of time? Is someone giving me, there's no one to give me the hook, so I guess we can.
Sorry, you were up first.
Just real quick.
Oh, go ahead.
Thank you. Casey Palaniuk with Google News Initiative. Assuming, or like in a dream world where all these advertising sort of reallocation to community media passes at the state level or even federally, something that we work with really closely and are really challenged with is spending our own money with community newspapers and local publishers, especially in the ethnic media group. I've run a number of different advertising campaigns like specifically designed to put dollars in pockets. And one of the issues we have is working with our agencies. It's too difficult, it's challenging. So we've designed all these programs to essentially like up-level and upskill the publishers to get those dollars in pocket. So I'm curious, like, yeah, in an implementation world, what can we be doing? What can CUNY be doing? Like, what can the local, or I guess the funders of journalism be doing to support that implementation?
Right, thank you, that's very interesting. We were involved in some of those in New York, and the same, if I understand correctly, the same problem happened with a lot of philanthropic, with other donors, because most of the community media is commercial, it's not nonprofit, and there's no expertise, and there's no kind of tradition of accessing these type of funds. What we do is we train the funders, sorry, not the funders, we train the publishers, and we try to find ways to, we've done a lot of workshops and, you know, direct coaching to publishers to find ways in which they can make it simpler, because they just are just so thirsty for funds, and everybody else was getting them, so why not them, you know? But I'm happy to share more if you want. Right.
Oh, we are getting the hook now?
Yes,
that the
but
hook?
she's asking a question because she's been
Oh,
saying
okay.
that I want her to ask.
I'll
try to
ignore
make
the
it-
hook first.
I'll try to make it quick. I'm genuinely curious about this. When I think about the infrastructure that's in place to try to move forward these policies, who has always been lobbying legislatures, especially in places outside of like New York or California, press associations in states have always lobbied legislatures, and they've
Right.
lobbied them on open government, but they've also lobbied them on the business interests of incumbent publishers. And a lot of what I saw, it's been a minute, but when I covered the legislature, was them basically trying to keep the wagons around public notice advertising and keep emerging digital publishers from accessing that. And we know that those press associations are now diminished because their membership's diminished, but are you in touch with them? Like, what does that look like? That they're still there. So what would that look like in terms of getting them on board with this, or have you talked to people about it?
That's a great question. I mean, first of all, I view part of Rebuild Local's job as being to build up capacity for advocacy for good public policy on the state level. And that's complicated. In the places where there's no press association, you have the issue of starting some, you know, getting people together and doing it. In the places where there is a state press association, some of the state press associations are very enlightened and progressive, and we've worked with them, and it's great. On the ones that are more like what you're describing, it's really hard. And all I can say is there are issues where the press association is aligned with the broader community, And I would say start there, and it doesn't solve the ones that you're talking about, but we found that even in our coalition, it's like, there's things that our people in our coalition disagree on, and we say, outside this off, go at it, but let's at least first figure out if there's something we can agree on and work on that first, and maybe over time that'll lead to relationships or trust or changes. I think we do actually have to stop, but we're here and we're happy to keep chatting informally. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Can't see the ground. Can we stop this gravity?